We are now going to affectionately refer to this tractor as Baby Cubby. Hey everyone, this is going to be an introduction to a machine that I typically wouldn't care to keep around. I don't have a lot of love for them, but one of the things I do love is taking care of things that nobody has ever given the time of day before. I picked that up for free. It was sitting in a barn, completely decrepit, had been sitting for several years. I actually did some services to it 4 or 5 years ago, and at that point in time I told the owner that really this machine needed more work than he was probably ever going to want to put into it. I think he ran it for probably a year or so after that, and then just parked it in the shed, and there it sat. I think I'm actually going to keep it, which was not my original plan. But I'll go over some of the things that it needed, and we'll talk about why I'm going to decide to keep it too. As you can see, I'm running out of room, and yeah, because you got the 3000 series with the 1000 series next to it. Then you got the 1250 back there with the headlights, and then you got, the 1882 here that just came in. So that plus all of the lawn boys that you can't even see in the other corner. I'm running out of room. But I have a hard time saying no to things that have been neglected and can be brought back to life. And that guy has done pretty good. So let's go through some of the things that you need to work on a 1000 series LT. They're cheap to work on. I'll give them that. We are now going to affectionately refer to this tractor as Baby Cubby. It's a Baby Cubby. So it is the small, tiny version of that. This is an LT1018. 2004, I think, is the model year. When I picked it up, it had all 4 flat tires. The battery cables have been chopped. The deck was in a complete state of decay. We'll go over that here in a minute. The engine wouldn't start even after the battery cables were fixed. A new battery was put in. Fuel system was shot. Pulleys and tensioning systems all over the thing were just crapped out. The transmission was... the fluid in the transmission looked like death. It has 500 hours on it, which, 500 hours on a machine like this is really... that's a lot of hours. With having done minimal maintenance, and I know how it was treated before, it had very little, if any, maintenance. It basically got what it needed when it needed it, and that was it. So if it cried for help, it got some love, but that was it. So yeah, it's got 500 hours on it. I've cleaned it up since I got it. You can see it's not all crusty now. It actually looks decent, despite its lack of attention and care that it's had. The deck is not there. The deck is over here. And I did quite a bit of work to that. That was actually, most of the work on this tractor went into that piece of crap deck. I mean, it really, unless the labor was free for you, this tractor was a throwaway. It was going to go to the scrap yard, and I wouldn't have hollered twice about it, because really, these are designed to be throwaway. They're built with cheap parts. They're built to a very low price point, and they're built to basically be used and then thrown away in a short period of time. 500 hours is pretty good. If you figure the typical owner puts 40 to 50 hours max on one of these things, 500 hours would be 10 years, and 10 years is a pretty long lifespan for something like this. This is like a $1,300, $1,400 mower. It's not really even a tractor as much as it is a riding mower. So to be able to bring it back to life and mow with it and be able to have something here that's easy to use and cheap to fix is pretty cool. It's, like I said, it's not going to do any heavy work. It's not meant for that, but if you get into one of these, you can find one super, super cheap. You're talking maybe a couple $100. And with a little bit of time and effort and not much money, you can really have something decent. So I will go over some of the problem areas that I've addressed and what I did to put as little money into this as possible and still have a good, well-running tractor. So here is the engine on the LT1018. It's an 18.5 horse Briggs ELS, which is pretty much an Intech. Not quite sure what the difference is between an ELS and an Intech. I think there's some differences in the air filtration, maybe, some of the other things. It's basically a Briggs Intech. It's a single cylinder. When I got to it, these battery cables here were completely shot. Actually, they were cut. They were cut. I had to splice in a new terminal and a new section of lead for it. The fuel system was completely rotted out and crapped. The starter was pretty weak, but one of the main things on a Briggs engine, if they're hard to crank and hard to start, is it's probably time to adjust the valves. So I did adjust the valves, and that helped, considerably with the cranking issues that it had. It actually runs pretty good. There's no oil pressure sending unit on this or anything, so I don't know what kind of oil pressure it's got, but it doesn't knock or smoke or anything. It actually runs really well for what it is. The air filtration on these is just crap, though. Like, they have this spring-loaded snapping mechanism here that just pulls this housing into the filter assembly, and it's not a very good seal. So they'll get debris coming past the air filter and into the intake there. So that's something to be mindful of. Keep a good eye on that, because that's one of the things. And it's more common on the twins, I think, than it is the singles, but the twins have a similar and even worse design for the air filtration. So I went through and took care of the battery cables and the fuel system, the solenoid, which is down here. The solenoid, actually on these tractors, the solenoid is in a really shitty spot. The solenoid was all corroded, all the connection points on the solenoid were corroded, and the ground down there was in bad shape. So I cleaned up all the connections, adjusted the valves, put an extra inline filter here going into the carb because the fuel pump still had crap in it that was shoving into the carburetor. So I fought carburetor issues for a while. I pulled the bowl and cleaned it a couple times, and it kept throwing stuff into it, so I put an extra filter here. It actually runs pretty good now. The hood was cracked down here. You can see where I JB welded that brace there. This was all bent and mangled. None of the lights worked. I mean, this thing was just roached. It was bad. But at this point, aside from buying a battery and throwing a couple fuel filters and an oil filter on it, I didn't have that much money in it. So, yeah, so reattached everything on the hood, made sure it was solid, did some things to the engine, and the engine has actually performed really well. Haven't had to go back in there at all. So after the engine was confirmed to be a decent runner, I moved on to the transmission. If something else doesn't go first, what's most likely going to die on these is the non-serviceable transmission. This is a lubed for life transmission, and the lube that they use from the factory for cost-cutting measures is just a typical, conventional, not even synthetic, 20W50 motor oil. This is a Hydro Gear 618-0319, I believe. The part number has been wiped off by brake clean as I went in here. I accidentally wiped it off, but I knew after the engine was taken care of, I had to do something about the transmission fluid. Without being able to confirm, lost my light. Without being able to confirm the condition or the level of the fluid, I had to pull the fender pan off. So you got to pull the whole fender pan's got to come off to get to the transmission fill plug, which is up in here somewhere. It's actually behind this plate and on the top of the transmission. You can feel for it if you put your hand down in here. You can actually feel for the fill plug at the top. And actually where my hand is now, that's the reservoir. So, yeah, I went in and popped open the fill plug, and it was some nasty stuff. It was gross. And rather than removing the transmission entirely, flipping it upside down, and draining the fluid out of the fill plug, I decided to install a drain plug. I can see if I can. Yeah, so underneath here, there's a section of the case that has just enough room, and on some case models they actually did provide provisions for a drain plug. This is right at the bottom of the case. So I very carefully drilled with the transmission in place, drilled and tapped for an 1/8 NPT hex threaded plug, or a square headed plug. And so now I'm able to drain the transmission fluid without pulling the transmission. Pulled out the fluid, it looked like crap. Ran some fresh motor oil through it once, and then did it again. It's only about 2 quarts. It's about all it holds, so it didn't take much. And yeah, the transmission actually sounds pretty good. Has decent power for what it is. So that was the next major thing to tackle. So now we know the engine and the transmission were decent, and moved on to the drive system. So I pressure washed it down from the top down, and you can see on the bottom it's still not very clean. But with the deck removed, you can see the main tensioning assembly here. This is for the drive belt. You can see the belt comes around this way, like that. This pivot point right here was completely loose underneath the fender pan. Up here, there's a, after you take the fender pan out, you can see the top bolt that holds the top nut that holds that pivot point. It was loose and just kind of hanging there, so I tightened that up. And I watched the belt operate at, you know, regular operating conditions with the fender pan off, and it looked just fine. The pulleys are a little loud, and I mean, it probably needs a new belt, but I just let that go because it was working fine. And I started focusing on the tensioning system for the PTO. So this here was also pivoting and super loose in this area right here. You can see where that, there's a big long bolt that goes through that pulley and up into the frame, and it's pushed against a washer by a spacer, and then there's another spacer above that, and then it goes all the way up here and ends up right there. That was also loose and just kind of hanging there. So what I did is I tightened that up, and I added some extra spacers, because even what I noticed is that the belt path from, you know, here's the belt path for the PTO. And then the belt goes there, goes around that pulley, comes around this one, and then, here goes my light again, and then comes down to the deck somewhere in here. What I noticed is that this center pivoting pulley right here was too far up. It was too far in this direction. And so when the belt was coming, you know, from the PTO down through this sequence of pulleys, it was grabbing the lower edge of this flat idler pulley and when it was grabbing that edge, it was chewing up the belt. I don't know why. I mean, maybe it was designed like that from the factory and it was just janky. It's very possible. I don't know. Regardless, I added some spacers in here, in between the pulley. I don't know if you can see it, in between the pulley and the bracket, to bring that pulley down a little bit so that it's more in line with those three there, because it actually goes to a fourth one down there. So that helped, and while I was under there, I noticed that this steering shaft bushing was completely shot, and that steering pinion was just flopping around in there. But here's the cool thing about these cheap throwaway tractors, is that the replacement parts are just dirt cheap. You know, they're made, they don't have grease points, they don't have bearings, they've got, in some cases they have a bushing, like the steering pinion gear actually has a bushing. Up in here in the frame there's a hex, there's a bushing with a hex on the outside edge of it that falls into this slot. So it was like $5. I got a new gear, and the gear was $5. And now, you know, before you could, let's see if I can do this with the phone. You can turn the steering wheel now, and it pretty much stays engaged. The pinion stays engaged with the main gear pretty well. Before, the whole pinion was just shifting backwards, away from the plate, and it was about to, I mean, it actually did skip a couple teeth on me a couple times. So yeah, put a new bushing in there. These bushings are still shot. These are just plastic, like nylon spacers here for, you know, the steering arm that goes that way. So that needs replaced. But again, that's like $10, right? So, you know, all together, it still, I guess if you're including labor, it's more than that. But, you know, if you can work on these things yourself, which they're not hard to work on, you know, there's, at this point, I probably had, with the battery, not even $100 in it. So, yeah, anywhere where something pivots or moves on these tractors is really the weak point. Because they didn't bother putting in grease fittings or bearings to save costs. They put in little bushings or spacers or, you know, shoulder bolts and stuff to try to hold stuff together. Also, while I was under here, I noticed they had somebody had the PTO off before, and there's a stop bracket up here that's supposed to stop the PTO from rotating while the engine's spinning and when you engage and disengage. Well, so whoever had this off of here before had it sitting inside of this bracket here. So, like, that ear there was inside the bracket. And so the PTO was able to shift back and forth inside that bracket. So I pulled it off, dropped it down, set it back into place. And actually over here it was, you could see where it was riding on that. It was hitting the steering pivot point right there. So I took care of that. That helped. Little by little, it started it started coming to life. It started feeling like it's something I could actually put some hours on and use. And so I moved over to the mowing deck, and that's where most of the time was spent. This is a Swiss cheese special. Look at all that. That's good. That's real good. So when I got this thing, the spindle on this side here was pretty much falling through the deck. The rodding that you can see here came all the way through here. And so I tried banging it back into place to make it run parallel to that spindle, and it didn't work. So what I ended up doing was cutting from here all the way around to here, just enough to hold it in place, but then be able to pivot it and line it back up. It was chewing belts. The belt that was on here wasn't even that old, and it was pretty toasted. So, spent a couple hours getting this particular portion of the deck done. Took a bunch of chunks of rebar and just welded them into the hole. And then, this guy here, the tensioner, pivot was all worn out, so I took it off and welded the contact surfaces where they'd basically worn grooves over time, and then drilled through the flange head bolt here, and then cross drilled through the bushing, and then tapped for a 1/4 grease fitting. So now that's able to be greased, and the main focus of this was get a deck that cuts and doesn't fall to pieces in a year. If this thing lasts a year or more, I'll be happy. Rattle canned the front of it with some fantastic Magic paint. Magic being the brand that most people are not very fond of. Just to keep some of the scale off of it, keep it from rusting. And over here, the back side of the deck I took down to bare metal and put rust bullet on the metal, and then I coated over with Rust-Oleum, and I swapped out the blades that were on it, that were mulching blades, for a high lift style blade, what you see here. These came from an LT1040 or something like 1042. It had to be a 1042, I'm pretty sure. They have a star center hole in the blade, so I had to notch out the star center to get them to fit. But it looks like the deck is self-cleaning pretty well. It's not building up a lot of debris, which should help it last a little longer. As with every single thing on these decks and on these machines, anything that pivots or moves and isn't greasable just goes south quick. So after spending several hours on this deck, I mowed with it for a couple hours the other day, and it actually mowed decently well, despite the fact that it's got a really shallow, it's a really shallow deck. It can't flow much. And despite the deck being warped from all the heat from the welding, it actually did pretty well. I had to offset the gauge wheels because the deck is pretty much like kind of pretzeled from all the welding in that one area. So like the wheel down here in this corner has to be set in a different hole than the wheel on this side, and then the wheel over here has to be set different than the wheel over here because the whole deck's kind of like twisted. So diagonally they're set the same, but side to side they're not. I also put 1 inch smaller belts on it to get a little more tension on the belt. So on the deck side, calls for a 67, and I put on a 66. And on the PTO side, it was the same thing. Calls for a 60, and I put on a 59. I also took the idler pulleys, and in order to prevent having to buy entirely new pulleys, I took the front seal off of this one and packed the bearings with grease and put the seal back on. It's nice and quiet. The whole deck is actually very quiet. It's got these GT style spindles that they phased out eventually, but the spindles are greasable. When they run really smooth and quiet, I can actually show you if you look over here on the 3000 series. Basically the same spindles on the 3000 series. Not much different. They last forever if you keep them greased. Yeah, like I said, they phase those out eventually, so there's a couple things on this machine that they hadn't quite cheaped out on yet, or they hadn't realized how they could, cut their costs. Let me put it that way. But in general, the deck runs smoothly as far as the bearings and spindles go. The bearings on the PTO, let's go over to the tractor. I already addressed those. I grease those in the same way. I'm going to show you those, and then the drive system, and this deck hanger here. So the deck hanger, if you look here, there's a pivot on either side, There's a pivot on either side for the deck hanger. And from the factory, the only thing that is installed on it is just that pin and then a cotter pin on the other side to hold it in place. And I added some washers to snug it up, and it brought the whole deck hanger up about a ½ an inch. So it's not all sloppy. The other thing that was really sloppy was the forward and reverse drive. This area right here. So this here is what the forward and reverse pedals connect to. And that was super sloppy, and it was the tractor never really had good forward speed even after changing the fluid. I didn't notice anything, you know, out of place as far as, you know, the hydro whining or losing power after it got hot or anything. And I noticed that there's just not a lot of travel here because, or there wasn't, because as you push this forward, the whole rod would rotate because it was so sloppy right there. So I adjusted it first because there's threads here, pulled it back a little further so I get a little more travel out of it. You do sacrifice reverse speed for gaining forward, so it's kind of a balancing act. But that's now to the point where it's got plenty of forward speed, or it has plenty of, you know, shifting at the transmission to get that much flow and get that much speed out to the wheels. The next thing is going to be the belts here for the drive system. They are really, the belt is really loose. I mean, it's barely held on there. In fact, the tensioning spring here, all right, let's see if I can grab it. Yeah, this tensioning spring is so loose that if you just push the bracket back, the spring loosens up. I mean, there's basically no tension on that belt. So if you really get into it and you push it, the belt slips. So we'll address that at some point. But yeah, you know, at this point I'll run it as is, see how it does. Probably end up pulling off each one of these idlers. And again, to save money, if the bearings aren't terrible, and I don't know if I can do it on these. I don't know if I can grease these. I'll try. On the bigger ones, I think there's a lip seal that I can pull out. None of the bearings sound real bad. They're just not quiet either. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and put the deck back on. Run it again. And now the hood's off of it because we had a bunch of wind the other day and I took it out to go mow with it, and the wind blew the hood up while I was driving the trailer and broke the bracket, or bent the hinge bracket severely. So over here, this bracket here, had to JB weld it again because it popped out. And this whole thing was bent, so that took a while. There's a bunch of different angles to work with on this hinge, so it's kind of finicky to get back into place. So after the hood's back on, the deck's back on, we'll run it again. Got some mowing to do this weekend. And we're slowly working towards the issues there. I don't think I've started it up for you yet, and it's probably about 40 degrees here or so. It's kind of cool, so we'll see how it does. I don't know if I got the brake on or not. Probably not. Here, let me sit on it. Okay, brake's on. Engine runs fantastic. It really does. It runs great. It starts great. It's a fuel sipper. It doesn't use much gas at all, being an overhead valve engine and being relatively small displacement. Yeah, so that's it. That's the Baby Cubby. That's where she's at. Oh, one more thing I forgot to mention. There's just so many little things on this. The spindles here are greasable, and so are the wheel bearings on these, which is nice. The steering is still a little tough, even with the tires aired up. So what I'm going to do, and I did this on a 2000 series before, and it really, really helped, is put two thrust washers on the spindles, one on the bottom here and one on the bottom over there, so that there's actually an actual, load bearing, thrust bearing underneath the spindle on the arm there, and that'll help with the steering effort considerably, decrease some of the wear on the parts, and relatively cheap. I think they're $7 a piece or something like that. And if you guys are interested in what those parts are, let me know. Cheap fix, and helps save the steering system from getting worn too quickly. Lots of little things you can do to these without spending a lot of money, and they're pretty decent little mowers. In the interest of being thorough, I just wanted to show you everything that was done on the LT1018 so far. Most of which was labor related and didn't require much money to fix. Battery cables, just did that with some stock that we had here. Remove and replace, and clean the solenoid connections, they were really bad. New battery, that was about $45. New spark plug, just had one laying around. I cleaned out the air filter, put new fuel filters in, which I have stock of here. Cleaned the carb, changed the oil, so there was $10 maybe there. Adjust the valves, free. Remove and clean out the shroud, free. Replace the steering bushing, $5 there. Replace steering gear, $5 there. Trans flush, $10 there. PTO pivot and bearings, again no parts went into that, just some grease. The deck pivot and bearings, some welding and grease there. Belts, there are 2 belts I bought for this, so that's $30 there. Tires, cut and filled them with washer fluid that came out of the 1882, so didn't have to spend anything there. Deck hanger, had some washers I put on that. I removed the fender pan, pressure washed it, repaired the hood hinges. That actually has happened twice now since I've written this list. Replaced the lights, which I had in stock. Drive belt and the pivot still needs done. The pivot that I'm referencing there is the tensioning pivot's pretty sloppy on it. So I'll see what I can do about that once I get the drive belt. And what's not on this list is steering spindle thrust washers. So that'll be $14. And then blades. Got some blades for it. Those are $25. So, for about $100, give or take. Took this thing from a complete wreck that was probably just going to go to the scrap and have a functioning unit now. So that is the roundup to Baby Cubby, and we'll move back over onto the 1882 soon.